Hi, thanks to everyone, whatever time of day it happens to be where you are, for coming to my talk. And thanks to Gary and Jiwa for inviting me to talk about non-conducting transitions in drug binding in hERG. Before I start, I do need to make the disclosure that I'm an officer and a shareholder in CiPA, which provided a lot of the equipment and software used in what I'm going to be talking about today. And what I'm going to be talking about today is the role of electrically silent transitions, that is, the ones that don't actually go through a conducting state, and drug binding. And these state-dependent drug binding properties have been noted in hERG, particularly for a long time. In this seminal paper on the hERG clone channel, it was concluded that hERG currents were not blocked by IKR-specific drugs such as methane sulfonamides. And this led to a few questions about what might be missing. The authors were very quick to turn around and say, well, what was missing was use dependence. So use dependence is very important for hERG. It can change you from having apparently no affinity to having very high affinity, because MK499, a methane sulfonamide blocker of IKR, did block with very high affinity the hERG current when things were repetitively pulsed. So when we opened and closed the channel and changed its conformation. So it's not surprising then that this occurs. Gating and blocking are really chemical reactions. The free energy of drug binding is a limited amount of energy between the interactions between the pore and the channel structure, and it's directly proportional to the concentration of the drug. Voltage-dependent gating occurs from the movement of charge from one side of the membrane to another. And because the force of voltage on charge is very large, the chemical potential will change exponentially with higher voltage. This is what gives us our I-ring, rate, Leary types of equations and the alpha and betas that we see in a Hodgkin and Huxley model. And then there are voltage-insensitive gating transitions, ones that are essentially diffusive in nature, that have constant free energy difference as the channel moves around. It's not so strongly affected by things as like voltage. Typical of that is inactivation through the ball and chain model. So you have inactivation, as classically described by Rick Aldridge for shaker channels, is N-type inactivation, where the channel goes through a sequence from closed, you apply a voltage, it opens up, the N-terminal domain has a spot where it can bind, and it diffuses, it's tethered, so hence the ball and the chain model, and diffuses into its binding site, and the channel goes from activated and open to an inactivated state. And then as you move back to negative potentials, the ball has to be removed before recovery can proceed back to a closed and resting state. So we have the process of activation, inactivation, recovery, and deactivation. And the real difference in modeling between these two is the Hodgkin and Huxley types of model has inactivation being essentially a voltage-dependent process with the biophysical implications of net charge movement, whereas the ball and chain is voltage insensitive. And so that energy for the inactivated state at a lot of different potentials is very different for two different types of models. And when we look at this, does it have any implications? And the answer is yes. Even though you can get models with these very different chemical bases, they can have very similar kinetic types of behavior. And so here's a model of the transient outward current opening and closing in response to a series of steps. And it's for two different models. One's a Hodgkin and Huxley model, expanded into a Markov model. So you have activation domains, 3 of them here, like an M cubed, open, one membrane moves, one voltage sensor moves, one voltage sensor moves. So you have 3 that are ready to move, 2, 1, and then finally all of them are moved, and you are open. And inactivation can proceed from any state, but does so in a voltage-dependent manner. That's the H gate, and it has its own intrinsic behavior in that. And of course now, because we're interested in block, we're going to just look at open channel block in relation to this. The ball and chain model is a little different. Activation, we still model as the same. We have voltage sensors there. There's no problem using the Hodgkin and Huxley formalism expanded into a Markov chain here, but nonetheless, Hodgkin and Huxley formalism. And then it's coupled to diffusion as a site becomes revealed and then becomes a sort of a good resting conformation. We have different affinities of the ball for it, but it's essentially a diffusive process. It diffuses on and then can diffuse off. And that gives us our channel opening. Here you open, and the open gate is pushed open by voltage, and voltage pushes the inactivation gate closed. Here the channel opens, but it opens up, it gets at least open or partially open, and inactivation then proceeds by diffusion to close it down. And there are maybe little differences you can see down here, which would be difficult to determine experimentally, but may have big implications. And really to illustrate that, then we have, of course, open channel block of an identical sort to this binding. And this open channel block for the two different models has a different sort of behavior. If we look at the bound in the terms of the model, as you stay depolarized, the voltage can sort of push the inactivation process forward, and by doing so, then push the open channel blocker out of the pore. And so you see increasingly less and less drug bound with time, and more drug is bound at later times with the partially coupled model because it reaches an equilibrium relatively quickly. And so your voltage-dependent equilibrium can have a really big difference. You can go from a sigmoid behavior for open channel block in a partially coupled type of model where you're competing with a ball and chain to a bell-shaped steady-state voltage equilibrium binding for drug. Well, if the channel is closed, then does this really matter? And the point is, yes, it does matter because it matters what happens in subsequent pulses. If we look at the rate dependence then of the channel after drug binding for the two different models and after equilibration, we see that for the Hodgkin and Huxley type of model, because you push all the drug off with sustained depolarization at positive potentials, when you start to recover, both models will recover at a relatively rapid rate, which is near that occurs normally. But if you have open channel block in the partially coupled model, you then have some channels that are blocked, and they recover very slowly as drug unbinds from them. And then we have some that recover very quickly because they were not blocked to begin with, and they were merely inactivated and show the rapid inactivation of the basal model. So use-dependent predictions are really sensitive to model values, potentially. Experimentally, different states can have orders of magnitude, different drug affinities. We've known this simply from the case of the methane sulfonanides and the initial descriptions of hERG. And that's because gating is a chemical reaction, and chemical reactions are sensitive to the chemical state of the reactants, and a channel goes through some fairly major changes in state as it goes through its physical conformations. And these change the chemical energy of the blocking relation. And so misallocation of these energy steps can lead to really significant differences in the kinetic behavior of an ion channel during the course of voltage or use dependence. Different model formulations also can give, even if they do give, we've gone through an example where two different formulations have the same behavior under voltage clamp, but we can find that some of these models give very different behaviors during the action potential. And so we looked at a few years ago, Quinlan Zhu and Glenn Abet looked at the behavior of a variety of models that are commonly employed in action potential models for mimicking the hERG current. And you can see markedly different shapes, magnitudes, time courses, and use dependence for all of these types of behaviors. And this leads you to the question that despite all these differences, how come all these action potential models that they're used in produce pretty much normal repolarization. And that sort of brings us to the question of, given that maybe some gross properties are mimicked, how much do they really matter in the calculation of the torsadogenic potential using the CiPA paradigm? To probe further into this, we used two different models, one of which is the Adeniran model, which is from Jules Hancock's lab, which has a linear type of hERG behavior and a very strong inward rectification and relatively slow kinetics for deactivation. And then we used the model that's included in the CiPA repo release for calculating the TMS score. Came out of Jiwali's work with Tom Kalatsky, where these models that model's made, and which is ultimately used in the CiPA paradigm for the calculation of torsadogenic potential. So the Adeniran model has this linear structure here, where you go through a series of closed states, obligatorily open, and have an inactivated state. Inactivation here is not diffusive, it's very strongly voltage dependent. There is a voltage insensitive step in the middle of this. But it's obviously a very different structure than what is used in the CiPA model. And that model has this sort of fourfold structure. It looks like an expanded Markov model with two activation steps and voltage dependent inactivation steps. But these steps are not all following the Markov expansion type of rules. They were independently fit to give appropriate model behavior. And so these base models, as we go forward and look at how to improve CiPA, how much do base models change cell performance? Well, we got two different hERG models that we're going to use, the Adeniran and the Lee models. And what we're going to do is we're going to directly attach the CiPA use dependence model, that model that's used for this. And initially we're going to do this in model cells using dynamic clamp to put this in real time, the same way we would be analyzing this type of data for real experiments. We can do this and have done this type of thing on a more limited basis because it's very expensive in iPSC-derived cardiac myocytes using dynamic clamp, so we can also change this to a biological system. And then we're going to use this and put these values in and these two basal models to look at QNet TMS type of scores. So to really illustrate again what I mean by the two models, we have the two models here, the CiPA model of Jiwali's and the Adeniran model components, so labeled physiological components here of from Jules Hancock's lab. And we've just gone ahead and blindly taken the pharmaceutical block model from the CiPA repro from Kalatsky and Jiwali's work, and all the parameters that were included for the various CiPA-12 training compounds for this pharmaceutical component, and put them in this model, and we're able to simulate them in real time using our voltage clamping systems on the dynamic clamp systems. And you can see that the shape of these models under voltage clamp is very different. We have different ratio of the peak current to the final current, different degrees of rectification at positive potentials, different time courses of activation, and we also have then, an average sort of behavior. So the models produce fairly different types of behavior, although the same sort of basic inward rectification, activation down near the foot of the action potential near that difficult region of the calcium window current. How to normalize these things and really evaluate them? Well, there are kind of two extreme ways that you can do that. One is to take and adjust the Adeniran model in current size so that the APs start out at the same basic level. And to do that, we just scale the Adeniran model up because it does not provide as much initial current during the plateau of the action potential as the FDA CiPA model, simply because, it shows a lot more inward rectification. And so you can adjust it that way, and it provides a very nice looking action potential despite its much different shape. But when you start to put on drugs, what you see is that the CiPA model is much more sensitive to block than the Adeniran model. Here we've just included the example of Bepredil, and we see that, starting from the same position. Well, another way to look at this then is to look at the differences in currents normalized by their peak current at -50, following a -80, +30, activation, +50, to normalize these currents. And similarly, because the Adeniran model produces very little outward current at very positive potentials, plateau becomes much more enlarged in the Adeniran model, and so the two model action potentials look very different. Not surprisingly, the action potential behavior in the presence of drug for the exact same Bepredil binding model looks very, very different. Same sort of order of things, but starting from a much smaller thing and a much larger, much more attenuated sort of a response in the Adeniran model. So the Adeniran model is much more attenuated than the CiPA model. So the question then is, well, how does this affect our measurement of QNet? And so we put this through a QNet analysis software package that's based on the FDA repo from their website, and built a shell on it, as well as several modeling things that are different in it, including the ability to put the Adeniran model in. And so we put the Adeniran model in. We combine this with the data on the other channels, and looked at the TMS scores. And for this, we used the exact same Gmax factor for this. So the Gmax was the same for this, the two currents. Not surprisingly, this is somewhere in between the response we saw for normalizing action potentials and normalizing peak currents. But still, the Adeniran model shows the prolongation of the action potential because it shows less current during the plateau phase, because it shows a higher incidence of, or a higher level of inward rectification. When we start to look then at all 12 of the CiPA training compounds, what we see is that despite the fact that things look very, very different, and we get a very different QNet score, what happens is it's all attenuated more or less proportionately. And so we have a linear regression between the CiPA TMS score and the Adeniran TMS score. And if we transform this along these axes here, what we find is that the two models, despite all of their differences, give approximately the same, or very close to the exact same, behavior in terms of predicting arrhythmogenic behavior. The only outlier here that didn't quite match was cisapride, which moved from low risk, intermediate risk, to high risk in terms of using the Adeniran model, but nonetheless, it was still highly predictive. So this shows that perhaps the model of drug binding and use dependence is very robust and may be very applicable once a few other things are optimized for other means of extraction from data parameters using models that may be more in tune with the actual physical data for the hERG channel. And so finally, I do want to acknowledge all the people who worked very hard on this from my group here. I particularly want to acknowledge Lee Corbel, who did a yeoman's job in working with the QNet software and getting these simulations up and working and integrating them with the dynamic clamp software, and Mark Nowak, who did most of the dynamic clamp work. Also, I want to thank Jules Hancox for his and the members of his lab that advised us on the Adeniran model, and Jiwa Lee for answering so many questions for us on the CiPA repo and the associated models. And I'll thank all of you for listening to me. Thank you very much.